Hey, welcome back. We're going to continue here with irradiance particles and open up a new example scene, okay? So now that we solved all of those problems that we had before with the Windows 32-bit and so on and so forth and the crashing with irradiance particles, now we've already solved that using the environment variable to switch back to the old BSP. So we won't have that problem anymore. So let's go ahead and open up an example scene here. The one that I want to open up is, we're not going to open up a irradiance particle start. We're going to open up this one up here called IP start. IP stands for irradiance particles. So not a very original name, but there you go. So IP start, let's go ahead and open that up. And here we go. It's a very simple scene. Okay, simply a big old box room with different colored walls. And then here we have sort of this column sitting there. Okay, and this scene has already had materials applied to it, and if we open up the material manager in case you're curious, and this is actually very important when working with lighting in mental ray, your materials come into play. Okay, so these are the materials that we have here. We have this green red material, the default scene material, a white material, and a yellow material. All of these materials that I've created, with the exception of the scene material, which I'm not using, which you can see here, there's no little check mark in the lower right like with these. That means that the C material is not being used. So these that are being used, you'll notice that they have the architectural material, which is that MIA architectural material, the mental ray one. It's physically accurate and can mimic almost any type of surface, almost any type of surface. So that's why it's called the architectural shader, because it can imitate pretty much any architectural material. Okay, so that covers that. Let me go ahead and close that. Now let's go back to our view here. Actually, just before I do that, we do have one light in our scene, and that's this big old area light right on the top. And there's no other lights in the scene. If I open up the Explorer, there's no default light. I've gotten rid of the default light. If I come over here to my ambience, I got rid of the ambience by knocking it all the way down to 0. And those are my default settings here for this specific scene. So I could try to eyeball my way back to the camera view that I had, but fortunately I've recorded two views here. This view right here and the second view right here. The second view is actually just the camera rotated like this to view the back of the room. And that's actually very important, and you're going to see in a moment why that is. Okay, so we're going to work with irradiance particles. We saw how to get it to work, how to get around that crashing problem. So now it's time to roll up our sleeves and get working here with irradiance particles. So what are some key things you need to know about irradiance particles before you begin? Okay, well, one of the main things about irradiance particles that a lot of new users have been figuring out, or at least they've thought that they've figured out, was that irradiance particles is very slow. Irradiance particles is supposed to not complement and not replace, but just be an extra option for you when it comes to indirect illumination and mental ray. So you don't have to stick with just photon mapping or final gathering. You now have this third option, which is irradiance particles. Now, unlike global illumination, photon mapping, and final gathering, which can be combined to come up with even better results, slow results I might add, irradiance particles works on its own. Irradiance particles does not work with final gathering. You cannot use final gathering and irradiance particles together. Won't work. Okay? Now you could use importans, which is the primary driving mechanism for irradiance particles. You could use importans with photon mapping, and we covered that in volume 1, so I won't go over that here and waste your time. Now, irradiance particles itself cannot be used with photon mapping. So you can use photon mapping with final gather, but you cannot use irradiance particles with anything else except caustics, and we'll see that later. But we can't use irradiance particles with photons from global illumination, and we cannot use irradiance particles with final gathering. So just getting that out of the way so you're well aware of that. Okay? Now, what are the benefits to irradiance particles, which I'm going to call them IP from now on. It's just shorter. Like I said before in a previous video, I don't want to sit here and say irradiance particles 5 million times and drive you nuts. So I'll just say IP 5 million times and drive you a little bit nuts. So IP. What are the benefits to IP? The question should be, i3D Jack, why in the world would I want to use IP? Okay? Well, let's go ahead and let's actually let's render out some IP here. I'm going to go up here and I'm going to go to my rendering options. Okay? And these settings are all fine. I have very low anti-aliasing settings just to get out faster renders. And Irradiance Particles is turned off. These are the default settings. As you can see, the enable checkbox is grayed out. So we'll go over here to the Photon Global tab and switch from Global Illumination Final Gather to Irradiance Particles. Then we'll go back to Irradiance Particles and turn them on. And these are the default settings. And as you can see here, we have our accuracy parameters, interpolation parameters, environment parameters. And if we go back to the Photon Global tab, now that Irradiance Particles are on, we have some importance parameters over here. Okay, so these are the default settings. We have this density parameter set to 1, diffuse bounces set to 0. We've got the accuracy parameters like so, 0, 250 rays, so on and so forth. These are the default settings that you get automatically from XSI when you first enable Irradiance Particles. So these settings have not been tweaked. So the question you should be asking yourself, are these settings good? And are they fast? Well, the answer to that question is that, well, the settings are pretty decent. They're not the best, but they're pretty decent. And are they optimized for render speed? No. By no means of the imagination are they optimized for rendering speed. So I'm going to prove that to you. Let me go to diagnostics and I'm going to turn information on so I can see what's going on with my renders. I'm also going to go ahead and open up my script editor here. And I'm going to clear that stuff out by right clicking and choosing clear all. Okay, let me just move this up and out of the way there. Just trying to fit this stuff here. Okay, so now that I have my diagnostics on, I have my default Irradiance particle settings. Let's go ahead and do a render preview of this with the Irradiance particles. Actually, before I do, let me just turn Irradiance particles off and do a preview render, just so you can see what this looks like without the Irradiance particles. This is just with direct illumination coming from the area light that's up on top of the ceiling. And I made the area light visible so it looks like this sort of light panel on the ceiling. You could see it. So that's our lighting. It's very nasty. I mean, the area light's good, but there's no indirect illumination. So I'm going to lock this render down so we can compare and contrast later. I'm going to turn the Irradiance particles back on, and you can see down here, I'm going to go ahead and clear this stuff out in my script editor. And what I'm going to do is simply do another render, this time with Irradiance particles. Okay, so the first stage is the emission of importance. You can see the importance being emitted right here. Okay, so it's going along 45, 47%, so on and so forth. It's taking a pretty good amount of time. I mean, it's not going super slow, but you probably want it to go super fast. And we'll see how to optimize in a later video. Right now, we're just learning about Irradiance particles. Next stage is to optimize the Irradiance particles. That's what it's doing right now. It's taking all that irradiance information from the particles and it's optimizing it. Then after that, it'll complete another stage, and we'll see that right now. It's computing the final irradiance pass for Irradiance particles. This is the phase that takes probably the longest to do. And protons are actually emitted very, very fast. And the optimization of the Irradiance particles map, or the IP map, is actually pretty decent. It's fairly quick. But when it has to compute the final irradiance pass for Irradiance particles, which is this one here, and the keyword here is final, this is the last pass before it actually starts to render the image out, you notice that the render speed drops significantly. So you're probably thinking to yourself, why is this happening? This shouldn't happen. I want it to go fast, real fast. Well, we can make it go fast as we'd like. It's a trade-off between speed and quality, just like with anything else, just like with photon mapping or final gathering. So what is the advantage to using IP? Well, there's a few advantages and disadvantages to IP. The major advantages are that IP is very easy to set up. You get less artifacting with IP as opposed to final gathering, where you really have to know what you're doing and you have to tweak and play with the settings all day to get a pretty good result. Okay, and you'll also end up with all kinds of color bleeding issues and artifacts with final gathering unless you're using super high settings. And the same thing with photon mapping, using global illumination and photons coming from lights. With photon mapping, you have to sit there and tweak your photon map for a long time. And you have to use tons and tons and tons of photons with high accuracy settings to get yourself even a fairly decent result. That's not even for a great result. That's just for a decent result at best. And of course, when we have those photon maps that have millions and millions of photons, you're going to end up with a very big map, and at the same time, it's going to take a while to render, a very long time to render. So photon mapping isn't very ideal. And to be honest, it's a pretty old technology. Same thing with final gathering. Final gathering's been around for many, many years. So the beauty about irradiance particles is that it's a fresh new algorithm developed by Mental Images to not replace photon mapping and final gathering, but just to give the user, you, the option to use a new type of indirect illumination algorithm. And in all honesty, irradiance particles are far superior in many ways to photon mapping and final gathering. They're much faster. They produce better, cleaner results with less artifacting, in most cases with no artifacting. If you know how to use the irradiance particles and you use them correctly, you can get some awesome results. Okay, and that's what this whole tutorial is about, to show you how to use them correctly and get those awesome results. So even though this looks like it's taking a long time to render, the reason that's happening is because right now it's using default settings, and when you're done with this tutorial you'll realize why you should not use the default settings in terms of speed. If you're going for a quick quality result, the default settings are actually great. They're going to give you a very clean result with no blotches or strange artifacts and stuff. It's going to look very, very nice for a high quality render. But like I said, the default settings are set up for a very high quality render, and that's why these settings are taking so long to render right now. I just wanted you to be aware of that. Okay, so we're going to be going over all the different parameters here to make irradiance particles render fast and good, and we're going to break it down. We're going to analyze all of these parameters, and you're going to get to see which parameters do what, which ones affect rendering time a lot, which ones affect less, which ones affect quality a lot, and which ones barely change anything for the quality and stuff like that. We're also going to see some tricks to rendering irradiance particles fairly quickly and with the maximum quality possible. Okay, so that's basically the benefit of IP. The fact that you don't have to be a render genius, you don't have to come in here and have years of experience using final gathering and photon mapping and stuff like that. You can just use IP simply by turning it on and rendering. Of course, like I said, it's going to take a long time because the default settings are set up for a pretty high quality render, which is probably not what you're going to want all the time. But if you're new to this and you're not very good with rendering, this is good news because it means that you don't have to be have a PhD in rendering in order to get this stuff done. All you got to do is turn on the irradiance particles enable checkbox, hit render, and you're pretty much good to go about 80 to 90% of the time. Okay. Now, what are some limitations to IP? There are some limitations to it. IP does not handle reflections very well. Um, it doesn't handle indirect illumination in regards to mirrors and transparent objects or objects that are semi-transparent. Okay, so if you're trying to do anything with a lot of transparency or things with a lot of reflections, you're not going to get the best results. You're actually going to get much better results if you use something like final gathering or photon mapping, believe it or not. Although you could get pretty decent results using IP with reflective objects or objects that are partially translucent or completely translucent and stuff like that. Though I really would not recommend it, but you can go for it and see what you can come up with. But I don't recommend it. So that's one of the I guess you could say one of the so-called limitations with IP, although it's not really such a big limitation when you think about it. Another great thing about IP is the way that it works in terms of mapping. With irradiance particles, you can create a map, and this is where the artists who work on architectural walkthroughs should really be paying attention right now, because what I'm telling you right now directly relates to you in your field. Okay, if you've used Mental Ray in the past for doing architectural walkthroughs or ArchViz or fly-throughs, anything like that, and of course more often than not, photorealism is the main thing to stick to when working on those kinds of projects. You've only had the options to work with photon mapping and final gathering. Most of the time you use final gathering because of it's just far superior to photon mapping in terms of the quality and stuff like that. But the problem with the final gathering algorithm is that it's dependent on each frame. So you have to first render out this huge final gather map for every frame of your scene. So if you have an animation that's 2 minutes long, you're going to have to sit there and do a final gather pass for 2 minutes, which can take a pretty long time to do. And on top of that, end up creating a massively huge final gather map if you used a lot of final gather points, and if the animation is very long. You're going to end up with a huge final gather map. So that's been one of the traditional problems using final gathering for walkthroughs. It's worked for walkthroughs, but not too well. If there's another option out there, usually you should take it as opposed to using final gathering. So that's one of the limitations of final gathering. With Irradiance particles, you no longer have to do that. I repeat, you no longer have to create a final gather type pass for your entire animation. Irradiance particles works great. All you have to do is render one frame out of Irradiance particles to create the map, which is what we're doing right now. Once that's complete, we can freeze the map just like we could with photon mapping and final gathering. Once the map is frozen, you can just move your camera anywhere you want and do renders from any angle, anywhere you want in your scene, whether it's the inside of a house or the outside of a building or something like that. And all you have to do is hit render, and you don't have to compute the Irradiance particle map ever again. Okay? That is a huge benefit. Why is that a huge benefit? Well, you might be sitting here thinking, well, these default settings are taking forever to render. I mean, this i3D Jack guy's been talking for about, what, like 5-6 minutes or something like that, and the Irradiance particles are still computing. It's still rendering out what's going on. Well, if you think about it, this is a lot faster than doing final gathering. If I wanted to create a final gather pass for this specific scene that I have right now, this little box room here, first, I wouldn't be able to do it. I wouldn't be able to simply tell it to render out final gather and then be able to render from any camera angle and get myself a good looking render. I would have a serious problem because anything that's outside of the camera view wouldn't have final gather applied to it, and I'd have a serious problem because final gathering is view dependent or camera dependent, and that's a problem. The only solution around that is for me to make a camera animation, whatever the camera animation is, a 360 or the camera moving around inside this room, and then I would have to render out a final gather pass for each frame of that little mini animation. But there's still a problem because I would be limited to only being able to take renders or create renders based on the camera's animation position. If I changed my mind and decided, you know what, I don't like the camera at this position, I'm just going to move it over in the bottom left corner or in the top right corner or wherever I want, I can't do that with final gathering. I would have to recompute my final gather map pass all over again, and that could easily take you a whole day's worth of rendering to get that done for an animation, and then you're limited to the animation, so you're pretty much stuck with final gathering. With IP, what you can do is just render from one frame, and you can get yourself an Irradiance particle map of your entire scene, and you don't have to worry about animation. You don't have to worry about doing a final gather type map pass where you have to render out final gathering and append to file every time you move the camera around. Okay, so it finished. Good thing I had my diagnostics open because it allows me to see some important information. One of the main pieces of information I want to see here is the wall clock, and the wall clock can be seen right here. And if you look at it, it says that this render took a total of 11 minutes and 27 seconds. Okay, and if we scroll up a little bit, we can see the wall clock for the Irradiance particles. This tells us that our render took 11 minutes and 24 seconds for computing the Irradiance particles. Since the total time was 11 minutes and 27 seconds, that means that most of our render time was spent on computing the Irradiance particles map, okay? And only about 3 seconds were spent on rendering the final image. So all of our render time right now is being wasted on the Irradiance particles. Another key component of these diagnostics I want to show you is up here, which is the Irradiance particles. This actually tells you the number of Irradiance particles. You can actually relate this to the importance. So what we have here is 136,800 Irradiance particles. That's a lot of Irradiance particles, okay? So where are we getting these Irradiance particles from? Because if you look at our render settings over here, we don't really see something for that. Now before I do anything, I don't want this thing to kickstart another render automatically, so I'm going to lock this render down immediately, just so that if I change any settings here in my mental ray render options, you won't see this thing starting to update and start re-rendering again, which can be pretty annoying. So I want to lock that down and freeze it. Okay, let's compare these two renders side by side. The render on the left is the first render I did without irradiance particles. That render is just the area light and that's it, just direct lighting. You can see that it's pretty fake because the ceiling up here is pitch black. In a real room like this, we would get light bouncing around in the room and we would be able to see some indirect illumination on this ceiling. Okay, if we look at the image on the right that has the default irradiance particle settings, we can see that that is in fact what's happening on the ceiling. We can now actually see it. And if you look carefully, you can see some color bleeding. You can see up here in this part of the ceiling, we're getting some sort of like a pink reddish hue, and that's because light is bouncing off of this red wall. Over here on the right, we can see some soft yellow because of course the wall on the far right is a yellowish color. So the image on the right looks way better than the image on the left. So let's close the image on the left. We're going to keep the one on the right. That's for radiance particles. Now these radiance particles took a good while to render, about 11 and a half minutes. Okay, so why did it take so long to render? Well, besides the fact of the obvious that it's using the default settings, there's actually other reasons why this took so long. And that's because the settings themselves. So we're going to look at the settings. We're going to see which settings control speed and which ones control quality. And we're also going to see how to get a trade-off between the two to get ourselves fairly fast renders fairly quickly at a good quality look. Okay, so since there's plenty to cover with irradiance particles, I'm not going to go ahead and start tweaking the irradiance particles right now. First, you need to understand what these parameters do, how they work, and what contribution they make to the final render. Okay, you need to know which position on the team all of these players here are playing, or else you won't understand how the game is played. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the most obvious parameter is the enable parameter, of course, which needs no explanation. Down here we have these accuracy parameters. We have interpolation and environment. So I'll start with accuracy up here. Okay, indirect passes. This parameter will directly affect your render time. The impact to render time is moderate. I wouldn't say that the render time impact by this parameter is high. I would say that it's moderate at best. Okay, the indirect passes, what does it do? Very quickly, what it does, it introduces an extra indirect pass to the particle map. Essentially, it works like with Final Gathering. You know how in Final Gathering when you add more diffuse bounces, and let me actually show you that real quick. I'll just go here to switch to Final Gathering, go back to Final Gathering, enable it, and down here we can see we have this diffuse parameter here. This allows you to create more final gathered bounces in your scene. So the default 0 means that there's one default bounce of light in your scene, which gives you the final gather look. If you add one more, you're going to get an extra bounce, which is going to brighten up your scene and make it look a bit more realistic. However, it's going to increase your render times by a lot. And the more you increase these diffuse bounces, the more your render times will increase dramatically, but you'll get yourself a little bit nicer lighting. That won't make too much of a difference in most cases. So I'm going to switch back to Irradiance Particles, go back to the Irradiance Particles tab. Okay. And let me just go over here. I'm just going to make sure that I turn Final Gathering off. Okay. So I'm back to Irradiance Particles here. So that's what indirect passes means. You can think of it as the diffuse bounces for Irradiance Particles. So the default is set to 0. Just like with Final Gathering, the diffuse bounces are by default set to 0, but I can increase it to 1 or 2 or whatever I want. Now the higher you increase the indirect passes, the longer the render is going to take, so be very aware of that. Then down here we have the raise parameter, which is by default set to 250. For testing and optimization purposes, 250 is much too high. The raise parameter is going to control the quality of the render dramatically, just like with the raise parameter for Final Gathering. Okay, works very similar. They're very alike. The higher this parameter is, the longer your render is going to take. The lower it is, the quicker your render is going to be. I'll just set it back to 250. The impact on rendering time by this parameter is very high. So keep that in mind. Then we have intensity. Intensity is not going to impact your render time at all. The only thing intensity does, it increases the brightness of the effect. So you can actually increase this intensity and make the indirect illumination brighter. I recommend using an intensity of 1. I wouldn't increase the intensity unless you're going for some kind of specific artistic look. If you're going for photorealism, leave the default setting of 1. It's perfectly fine. Then down here we have interpolation. What does interpolation do? It works very similar to how Final Gather has interpolation. Final Gather has always had interpolation, and only until recently have they created actually with the release of Exercise 7, we have the new force mode for Final Gathering. So let me actually go ahead and show you that very quickly. I'm going to switch to Final Gathering over here, and I'm going to show you. We have these different accuracy modes for Final Gathering. We have multi-frame, automatic, expert, legacy. All of these have interpolation. So what's the point of interpolation? Interpolation increases the speed of the render. It allows you to render much faster, but it sacrifices physical accuracy. So that's something to take note of. That's been one of the problems of Final Gathering in the past. With Exercise 7, they introduced this new exact mode, which allows you to not use any type of interpolation with Final Gathering. But the problem with that is it introduces a lot of noise, and to get rid of that noise you have to use a very high number of rays. And of course, I don't need to tell you that the problem with using a high number of rays of Final Gathering is that the render time slows down dramatically. So let me turn Final Gathering off and let's go back to Irradiance particles. Okay, so it's good that we have interpolation with Irradiance particles because it allows us to render much faster than we would otherwise if we didn't have the interpolation parameters. And we have a drop down box. We can actually turn interpolation off. This is a sort of brute force method. What do I mean by brute force? What I mean is that there's no interpolation. Irradiance particles are going to go ahead and render out without any type of interpolation. What's the advantage to rendering without interpolation? The advantage is that you get the best possible physical accuracy that you can get. So your renders are going to look fantastic. The downside to it is there's no interpolation. Because of that, you can't use a map. And because of that, your renders are going to take forever. So if you want to do, say, a camera animation or a walkthrough or fly through of an architectural scene or anything, you're not going to be able to do it with using this mode here with no interpolation, with interpolation set to never, because your renders will take forever to render. Okay, so unless you have a super cluster farm of computers and render farms and all kinds of stuff, that ain't going to work. So we're going to stick with interpolation. Now we do have this third option down here called for secondary rays only. This mode of interpolation works exactly as the name suggests. Interpolation is reserved only for the secondary rays. In other words, the rays bouncing around in the scene. A secondary ray could be a ray that refracts or reflects. This mode I do not recommend. In my experience, I have gotten lots of artifacting with this mode. I don't like it. It also takes long to render. It's not as fast as the always mode because always interpolates every irradiance particle ray in the scene. And that's what you want to do. You want to interpolate so you can render faster. And unlike with Final Gathering where interpolation actually really hurts the quality of the render, with irradiance particles you really don't have that problem. The interpolation works fantastic. It works flawlessly and creates some very nice, very accurate results. Honestly, you'll be very hard pressed to be able to tell the difference between an interpolated render and a non-interpolated render. As long as the settings with interpolation are set good enough and you know what you're doing, you can get an artifact-free render, which is the idea behind irradiance particles. Okay? Then down here we have this points parameter. This points parameter controls how many points are taken into consideration for interpolation. Interpolation is basically averaging the sum of the irradiance value of these different points, the different irradiance particles in your scene. Okay? The higher this number, the smoother the result's going to be. However, the less accuracy you're going to get. Similar to Final Gathering. When you use a lot of interpolation with Final Gathering, you sacrifice physical accuracy for quality. Okay? So when using irradiance particles, when you run into any type of artifacting, which we actually don't see any artifacting in this render with the default settings, but if we did have any type of artifacting, you would increase the interpolation until you got rid of the artifacting. Basically, it smooths out the result. So That's the benefit to using the points value here for interpolation. Now, one thing to make note of is that this interpolation will not dramatically impact your render time. I'll say that again. The interpolation will not dramatically impact your render time. So feel free to use high numbers if you have to. The default setting is 50. Then down here we have environment. Environment is very, very interesting. Okay, before I say anything else about environment, the first thing I want to say is that the environment parameters are not a very optimized use of Irradiance particles. Your renders will look nice. However, using an environment parameters will dramatically, I'll say that again, will dramatically increase your render times. Okay? The way that the environment rays works, or these environment parameters down here, they're based on the environment shader in your scene. So let me lock this PPG down. Let me go to render. I'll go to pass options. Okay? If we go over here to pass shaders, you'll notice that we don't have an environment shader. If we did, and we have this environment parameter turned on, this parameter is going to go ahead and it's going to shoot out rays based on this environment shader. So what kind of environment shader can you use? You can use an HDR image, or you can even use the Mental Ray Physical Sky environment shader setup to take advantage of this environment parameter here. My recommendation is to turn environment off whenever possible, because environment will go ahead and tag on a lot of needless and extra rendering time which you really don't need. Okay, so I would try to stay away from using the environment parameters as much as possible. It's not that they don't work or anything like that, don't get me wrong, but they're just extremely slow, and it's going to slow your overall render time down pretty dramatically. I mean, I've seen instances where just the environment parameters can easily make a 10-minute render turn to 20 minutes or 15 minutes, something like that. So it really dramatically impacts your render time. Okay, but I will show you how they work. But I'm not going to show you in this set of videos because this box room doesn't have an environment, as you saw, and it's basically an interior space, so we don't have to use the environment parameters, so I'm going to have to turn them off. Okay, but for now I'll just talk to you about what they do very quickly here. The rays parameter does exactly what it says. It controls the rays contribution for any environment rays or any environment irradiance particles. Okay, if it's set to 0, that doesn't mean that no irradiance particles for environment will be used. What that means is that it's going to use the number of rays used up here for the primary accuracy rays. Okay, so if your accuracy rays up here are set to 250 and your environment rays down here set to 0, what you're telling Mental Ray is set the environment rays to the same number as the primary rays up here. So actually what's happening is that when it renders out, it's not going to render out with 0 environment rays. It's actually going to render out with 250 rays or 1408. Whatever this setting is, that's what Mental Ray is going to choose for the environment rays. So setting this to 0 basically gives Mental Ray automatic control of this parameter. So the best thing to do is always do this. Always set your rays parameter independently of the rays up here. Okay? If you don't do that, you're going to be in a lot of pain because your render times are going to increase. They're going to shoot through the roof. Because if you're using a lot of rays here, you usually don't have to use too many rays down here. For example, for a production render, maybe you use 500 rays up here. You can maybe get away with 128 down here, or maybe 200, something like that. So keep that in mind. And then down here we have an intensity. This intensity works exactly the same way as the intensity up here. I would leave it at the default of 1. I wouldn't change it unless you really want to or have to for whatever reason. Okay? Alright, so that covers that. Down here we have a rebuild map option. This is a great option because it works exactly like with photon mapping and final gathering. If you turn it off, you essentially freeze the map. What does that mean? That means I can move my camera around in my scene, render again, and I don't have to compute irradiance particles over and over again every time I render. So it's a very important parameter and very useful. So just keep that in mind, okay? Alright, so let me actually show you how that parameter works by actually doing some test renders. I'm going to go to my second camera view up here, okay? And you can see if I move this out of the way, it's this camera view from here. Let's go ahead and create another render preview here. And you notice it's not computing irradiance particles. It's just going straight to the final render. It's not wasting time computing any extra stuff. The map is frozen and it's just going to render this thing out. Okay, so it's done rendering. I'm going to lock that render down. Let's compare and contrast here. We actually have ourselves a pretty good render over here on the right. We do have some artifacting, some light splotching here and inconsistencies, which means that even with the default settings, we still don't get the best result possible. So we still have to tweak this thing to get it to look good. But that's something that we'll discuss in another video. Right now I just wanted to show you what the rebuild parameter does. So we froze the map and now we can take renders of any angle of our scene, and unlike with Final Gathering, we don't have to append any Final Gather points to file. We don't have to create a Final Gather map pass or anything like that. We just create one Irradiance particle map that took 11.5 minutes to render, and now we can render from any point in our scene. So you can do the Irradiance particle map, and then afterwards you can give this scene to your animator and he can do his camera animation, and you don't have to worry about doing a Final Gather pass. Isn't that just beautiful? That's fantastic. You just gotta love these Irradiance particles. Okay, so let's move over here to the Photon Global tab. Very quickly here, we have two importance parameters. Okay, now I went pretty in-depth with importance and global illumination in the first volume of this series. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tackle importance and explain it to you from the Irradiance particles point of view. The Irradiance particles are basically being computed based on these importance. See, what happens is that when you start rendering with Irradiance particles, the camera, not the lights, but the camera is going to shoot out importance. And these importance are going to go into your scene, and then the Irradiance particles are going to use the positions of these importance to go ahead and create this nice render and create some indirect illumination. So you probably see this default setting of 1 and think, well, that looks like a pretty low setting. What if I crank this up? Believe me, you do not want to do that. That would be a very big mistake. Okay? The default setting of 1 is actually a high-end setting. I know it may not look like it because the slider goes all the way to up, to 5, to 5, but it's very important for you to understand that a density of 1 is actually very, very high, and in many cases, it's overkill, and it increases your render time dramatically. So density parameter controls the quality, controls the how much artifacts or how little artifacting you have with your Irradiance particles, and it impacts render time dramatically. I mean, by a lot. Okay, we can get our render down from 11.5 minutes down to about 1 minute just with this parameter alone. So it's very important parameter for you to understand. Okay, when you're testing and tweaking, you want to use lower parameters, but we'll go over that in another video that I'll dedicate specifically to that. Right now I'm just kind of going over these parameters quickly here. Okay, diffuse bounces. Diffuse bounces is also known as trace depth, and actually the correct mental image's name for this parameter is trace depth. In XSI it's known as diffuse bounces, but it's actually the same thing. Okay, what this does, it tells the importance how many times to bounce around in your scene. Very similar to the way that global illumination photons fired from a light bounce around in your scene. Okay, so the default is set to 0. That's not a very good setting to use. Actually, you should never use 0 when using Irradiance particles. You should always use something like 2 or maybe even 4. Anything higher than that is not going to make a difference in your final render results, but it is going to add extra rendering time, so it's very pointless to go past 4. Okay? Many times you can do as little as 2. I wouldn't recommend anything less than 2. So you're probably wondering, why in the world, Jack, would I want to use these diffuse bounces? What's the benefit? The benefit is that if you can get importance to bounce around in your scene enough times, you can create a beautiful particle, Irradiance particles map that you never have to recompute again, and you can render from any camera angle. If you recall, when I rendered from this other angle over here, we did have some artifacting on the ceiling and on the back wall. It's very subtle, but it's there if you look very carefully when it finishes rendering. The thing that's controlling that is, well, part of what's controlling that is the importance. If we don't have the importance bouncing around enough in our scene, we're going to have some serious problems and limitations. We're pretty much limiting Irradiance particles. to only one bounce of light. Okay, so it's very important to understand that. Let me close that. So you should always go with a setting of 2 to 4, which will work out fine in about 90% of the work that you do. Okay, so very important. The default setting is 0. The impact on rendering time, increasing this diffuse bounces parameter does increase your render time, but the increase is very minimal. So the impact on render time here is minimal. Okay, impact on render time for the density is very, very high and dramatic. Back over here, the indirect passes have a very moderate impact on render time. Raise has a high impact on render time. Intensity has no impact. Interpolation actually saves you render time. So the impact for render time is high, but in a good way. Okay. The interpolation for points has virtually no impact on render time, very little if any. Okay. And the environment parameters here have a very high impact on render time. The raise parameter has a very high impact on render time. The intensity does not have any impact on render time. Okay. And then of course we have the rebuild option. Okay. So we saw the default settings, we saw what Irradiance particles can do. This is a much nicer result than with Final Gathering. We don't have any color splotching here on these corners and things. We don't have any type of artifacting here, at least not in this full frontal view. Besides the fact that we have to increase the anti-aliasing, of course. So we can see our shadows there from our area light look very nasty. But that's not because of the Irradiance particles. That's happening because my anti-aliasing settings are set to -2 and 0, which are low preview settings, okay? But the Irradiance particle solution came out very, very nice. Okay, so this video has gone long enough. I'm going to end it here, and in the next video we're going to continue with Irradiance particles, and we're actually going to start to use it in practice and start to dissect the settings and see how they work.